Hello and welcome, I'm Rob King and this is episode number 4 of our Cyser. Now in episode number 1 we looked at the different types of drinks that are possible with mead and then moved on to the Cyser brew day. In episode number 2 we looked at fermentation and some of the challenges we had with the hydrometer reading. Then in episode 3 was a bit of a conundrum and how we might be able to restart the fermentation to try and get the gravity a little higher. Now in episode number 4 we move on to the next steps, which is first of all is a move to a mini keg where we will force carbonate and then move from carbonation into bottling. Also with mini kegging you sometimes run into problems, and we did in this episode, a problem with a CO2 leak and the diagnosis for sorting that out. We then move on to the evaluation. After all of the challenges and problems, how did it actually turn out in the end? And finally, we'll come back to some of the lessons learned from this whole process. So thank you very much for watching. Please do like, subscribe and share, and let's get on with it. This is Cyser day 89 and we're on the move. The next step is to put it in the fridge. Check in on my fridge. Not really very much to report so far. Cyser day 102. Cyser is day 117. It has been 3 weeks in the fridge. That was slightly longer than planned, but it is now time to put it in the keg and give it a bit of carbonation. 6 weeks ago, I racked it into this 3.8 litre demijohn, and at the same time I just gave it a bit of an extra shot of yeast and nutrients to try and bring up the ABV. The ABV hadn't quite hit the target that I'd expected. It was coming in at a respectable 11%, but the yeast tolerance was up to 18 and I was expecting a few percentages more. So we'll see if that actually had any effect whatsoever. If it didn't, then there is a lesson learned here. I think with mead, you can actually feed the mead early on with additional yeast and yeast nutrient, or particularly nutrient, I think. So, and it's something I didn't do. And I think when I do my third mead, it's something I'll focus on more. However, today we're just going to do a check and then we're going to put it in the keg to carbonate. Of course, I'm not going to be able to take a hydrometer reading straight away. The temperature of this, I'll check in a moment, is just come out of the fridge, so it is going to be fairly significantly below 20 degrees. So I'm going to have to wait for this to warm up. I don't know if you can see that, but that's pretty clear. That looks very nice. Oh, very strong honey. I don't really smell apples at all. We're going to put that to one side and do the hydrometer reading in a moment. The keg has been in the fridge, cooling down. I'm going to start by priming the keg before we begin. Everything's been sanitized. We're just going to pop some CO2 in the keg. Now, I'm going to do this differently to how I've done it before. Normally you feed in CO2 through the CO2 line keg, obviously. However, because what I want to do is force carbonate this, one of the things you can do is basically bubble the CO2 through the liquid, and to do that you need to actually put the CO2 through the beer line. So this time, as a change to normal process, and we'll see how this goes, we're going to actually feed the CO2 in through the beer line. But this is just priming before we transfer, so we can try and give it a bit of protection. So that's loaded some CO2 in there, so when we put the mead in at the bottom, there'll still be that layer of CO2 on the top. Air should have been pushed up, so that should have released out any of the air that was there in the top. Next step is siphoning. Quite a lot has dropped out of suspension at the bottom. I am going to probably leave a little bit behind just to make sure I don't take any of that with me. I lifted the siphon just a little bit at the end there when it started to look like it was moving the least around, so we are good. So as we said, we are going to first of all pressurise, but this time when we pressurise, it is obviously going to go through the dip tube, through the mead and bubble up. So we should hear the bubbles, I'm imagining. Down. Right, so again, there's probably some air at the top, so I'm just gonna have to let a bit of that out. So at the moment, the pressure's not particularly high. It's just below 10, somewhere between 8 and 10. So I'm going to bring that up a little bit. So that's just below 30, because we want to, next step we want to do is we want to try and force carbonate a little bit. And I'm going to do the old rock method, which means I need to move the camera a little. That's quite full, I can feel that. The greater surface area here gives more opportunity for exposure to the CO2. So 5 minutes of rocking. If I give this a rigorous shake, you'll hear the bubbles going through the dip tube. That's the CO2 being absorbed, or at least going through, helping it to absorb. I stopped my rocking and rolling a little earlier because I've started to develop a leak. There was starting to come out of the beer post actually, and I can feel that post moves. Whereas the gas post was really tight, that was actually quite loose. Oh, shock! My CO2 bulb seems to have run out. I'm gonna have to buy some more of these. So I think that's a good enough start. I've got that back up to almost 30 psi. You could hear it bubbling through. As it absorbs, it will continue to bubble through because the pressure's on there. So there's nothing more to do right now other than put this back in the fridge for a little while. I'm not really wanting to massively overcarbonate this, so I'm sort of imagining that it's probably just about ready already, but probably we'll give it 24 hours and then reduce the pressure on it down to just dispensing pressure. I seem to have a leak. I can hear a leak. Right, I'm just going to get a spanner to tighten these pegs up. The pressure relief valve post was also loose, so all three have been given a bit of a tighten up. I've put this back on and I haven't actually lost very much pressure. We're coming in, even though this is off at the moment, we're coming in at a pressure of just below sort of 20 psi. So I think perhaps 30 psi is a bit high. I haven't really done it that high before. I've tended to be around the 20-25 mark, so I'm just going to nudge it up just to make sure that this is all working okay. Get it up to 20, 21, 22, and then I'm going to stop at that point. 25. Wow. So, good. This is going in the fridge. I'm just going to leave it there to listen to just a bit longer. Make sure we don't get any more leaks, but unlike a moment ago, I can't hear that hissing sound, so that's a positive. So, Cyser, bit of fun and games, always is, but we'll be ready for going in the bottle carbonated very shortly. Now, there are lots of choices with meads to prevent bottle bombs, because that's always a danger. This one has been in the fridge longer than I planned. That should have killed off the yeast and the yeast activity quite sufficiently, particularly the length of time it was in there. I'm not adding any more honey or sugar or anything else to carbonate. It's just purely CO2 that's carbonating. So hopefully what we've got here is sort of a nice clean very clear, hopefully, mead that will go into the bottles. So back in a day or two. Using the beer post is a bit of a tighter fit in the fridge. It's only been in the fridge for 24 hours, but the Cyser is off for bottling. Right, getting ready for counter pressure bottle filling. This is my production line, so I've got my bottles here, my Cyser here. This is to stop the keg falling over once it starts to empty out. It's quite heavy now. When it gets to the bottom, it starts to get a bit wobbly, and then I'll be able to do the bottling here. So that's the plan. Time lapse, here we come. This was in the keg, so we did well on the bottling, not much left behind. A little bit of sediment in there. And this is what was left in the final bottle. Looks nice and clear. This is our little tester. And here are our bottles. Well, I'm still not sure exactly about this one. We've had some hits and misses and the strange gravity readings, so it's hard to know exactly where we've ended up. Did we have a reasonably alcoholic drink or just a lightly alcoholic drink? Hard to tell. This is so honey. It is almost entirely honey flavoured. No apple flavour in there at all. Very, very lightly carbonated, which is exactly what we wanted. So when I poured it, there were, albeit there was only a tiny bit in the bottle, when we poured it, there were just a few bubbles in there. It is quite warming. It is nearing a sort of liqueur-ish style, sweetness, liqueur-ish style warmth as you drink it. So, and it's not harsh. You sort of imagine that being quite young as it is, it would be quite, have a bit more harshness to it. Certainly that's not the case. Certainly it's a sipping drink though. Well, it's time to open the Cyser. Here we are. Nice pop. Oh, lovely aroma. See a little of that carbonation coming through. I'm not sure what the etiquette for a Cyser is, but at 11% I figured pouring a pint glass was probably the wrong quantity, so I'm going to go with this one. That is lovely and clear. A few little bubbles in there, slightly carbonated. The aroma is exceptionally strong. The honey definitely comes through. I am trying to get a hint of apple, and I do get a little bit of it, though very much like the dried apple that we added in secondary. Quite faint though, it is hard to detect that. Wow. Cool. So just a little sip. quite liqueur-like. I mean, it's only 11%, but it is quite liqueur-like in that hit. It's quite thick and full. It's not a light drink at all. Oh wow, that is the long sip, and that does have quite a hit. Gosh, I'm not sure it's supposed to have quite that hit, but it certainly does. I wonder if that hit actually is because it's too young. So maybe the Cyser needs a little longer. Yes. Let me try that one again. It is exceptionally sweet. I like a sweet drink. But this would very much be an aperitif, I think, given this level of sweetness. I wonder if that starting gravity was just far too high, and the addition of fruit in secondary actually probably brought the alcohol content level up higher, potentially, than 11%, though I can't be certain of that. Feeling on the tongue is quite syrupy, and again I think that potentially is because the final gravity ended up a little higher than perhaps I was expecting. Interesting. It's a drink I could drink in this sort of quantity as a little bit of a tipple after a meal, but to drink in the same way as perhaps a pint of mead or something like that, I don't think that would be particularly something that you could do with this. Does that mean this has turned out slightly wrong? I need to sort of compare and to sort of see other evaluations, or does it mean that this is just a bit too early and needs to smooth out, or is this correct and I'm just have nothing quite to compare it to right now? I quite enjoy a honey rum, and the nearest next comparison is probably to a honey rum. A honey rum comes in also around about 20%, so it's not a very strong drink. Yeah, there are some similarities there to a honey rum, but this one has much more honey flavour to it, and is a much more thicker taste on the tongue. But I'm celebrating moving into a new home, so cheers everyone, happy homebrewing. And so we arrive at the lessons learned. And the first couple, a shout out to PM125. Thank you very much for your feedback and advice as I've been going through this and other brews. Lesson number 1 is the use of pectic enzyme, and it was completely unnecessary in this brew because it was store-bought apple juice. I have used pectic enzyme successfully when I've used fresh apples in a cider, but for turbo ciders and store-bought apple juice, just not necessary. So, bit of overkill in my recipe. Lesson number 2 is the use of raisins. Now, it was part of the recipe for the Cyser. However, I did incorrectly reference it as a nutrient, and it's not a nutrient. It is actually just something that was part of the flavouring for this particular drink. Lesson number 3, I will call Feed the Mead. Now, I pretty much put all the ingredients together and then left it all alone. However, it is more appropriate in many recipes to continually feed nutrients into the brew to actually make sure the fermentation gets the best out of it. And I do wonder if I'd have done that, I would have ended up with a better result at the beginning. It's hard to know for sure, but certainly that was an alternative that I had at my disposal over the episode 3 of going back and trying to add some additional yeast later on in the process. Lesson number 4 was a big thumbs up. This was the forced carbonation through the dip tube, and certainly it did carbonate it to the right level and carbonate it very quickly. So that's something I will do again in future brews that I want to force carbonate. However, as a rule of thumb, I tend to just leave it alone and let it carbonate over a couple of weeks. But for forced carbonation, definitely dip tube is a winner. Lesson number 5 then is the pressure rating of the keg. Now I set the pressure rating at 30 psi quite early on during the forced carbonation stage. This was a bit high anyway, I didn't really need to set it that high. However, it also then sprung a leak. So I do think that I had exceeded what was a reasonable pressure for these little mini kegs. So I think the pressure rating on the kegs is something I need to just be a little bit more cautious about, and also don't set the pressure so high unnecessarily. Which leads me neatly on to the final lesson number 6, which is that understanding of forced carbonation and the pressure that I need to set it at. To actually pressurize over a couple of weeks, I only needed to set this to something like 8 to 10 psi. However, I did just want to get a small amount of carbonation, and I probably achieved that within the first 5 or 10 minutes of the forced carbonation that I did. Certainly though, more by luck than judgment, the carbonation on this was super, so it all worked out in the end. Well, that's it for this episode. Thank you very much for watching. Please do like and subscribe and comment. I'd love to hear your feedback. And in the meantime, happy homebrewing.